and answer some of those questions live. And if not, I hope that we have a little bit of time at the end to answer some more of those questions. But this is your warning that you're about to get a lot of content in the next 45 minutes. So my name is Alexis Lankford. I use she, her pronouns. We're going to talk about my introduction here in a little bit. So first, I do like to start with a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that the land we in Bowling Green State University occupy was once that of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Miami people who were forcibly displaced from their land by the U.S. government's Indian Removal Act. We recognize that our presence on this land is a consequence of colonization, forced displacement, and genocide of these Indigenous people. We begin to work towards restoration by raising awareness of the effects of colonization in the past and present, honoring the many Indigenous people who have found their homes here, and working towards decolonization within and beyond our educational settings. So you can take this opportunity to actually text this number, 907-312-5085. You can text your zip code or your city, state, and they will actually tell you what land you're currently occupying. You can also use these links that I can share at the end of the presentation. And this is just a first step. So this is some of our awareness and recognizing that most of the land that we are on was not ours originally. We came in and colonized and took this land from other Indigenous tribes. And so part of giving this back to them and part of this restoration is to be knowledgeable of that and being aware so that we can then take action later on. So who am I? So as Christina said, my name is Alexis Lankford. I use she, her pronouns. I have a bachelor's in education with mathematics from Wichita State University, go Shocks. I also have a master's in college student personnel from Bowling Green State University, and I serve as a coordinator of diversity and inclusion for the College of Education and Human Development. My salient identities, these are the identities that are going to show up the most for me right now, is that I'm Black and biracial, and that I do identify as a cisgender woman. And so for a lot of today's presentation, I'll be using examples from my experience, and a lot of them are going to go back to my race and me being a woman. And so know that a lot of these examples you could use in your own experience, but mine are going to be rooted in my experience. Okay, so outcomes. So my hope is that as participants, after going through this entire session, you will have strategies such as active listening, reiteration, and both and technique. You'll be able to understand when to start and pause conversations, and we're going to look at some classroom strategies as well. Oh, it wanted to take me out of my presentation. That was weird. Oh. Okay, so prep work. So anytime we're going to have these difficult conversations, I really stress prep work. It's just going to help you be more prepared in going into this. Ooh, sorry, I don't know why my computer is being weird. Here we go. Okay, so first I want you to check your emotions, bias, and understanding before you're going into this conversation whenever possible. And this is specifically too for when you're having structured conversations, which we'll talk more about. And in those, you're really going to want to make sure you have all your prep work done. So what are the different emotions that you're currently feeling? Are you still up in your feelings? Are you getting angry? Are you feeling fragile? What is happening for you? And are you going to be able to have this conversation? Your bias, are you taking certain situations in one way or the other? Bias as it is can be positive or negative, and every situation is different. So just try to keep that in mind. And I'm actually going to turn off my subtitles because I think they are messing up my presentation. Well, we'll see if it works now. Sorry about that, friends. I decided to keep this presentation on my OneDrive, and I'm learning things from that. So it looks like we're doing better now. All right. So knowing those different understandings, emotions, and bias are just going to help you be better prepared for this conversation. And it's also going to be able to help you stay on topic when this conversation is happening. So the other thing to be aware of, people are going to come from a variety of backgrounds, and they're going to approach the conversation with different knowledge. So knowing that, if you know this person, and I hope you do, relationships are really important within all of this work, that if you have that relationship, you're going to maybe know, oh, because of this, they're going to have this background, right? So specifically thinking of folks from the Asian community, and specifically looking at Japanese and Korean culture, there's a lot of things built into there to say, we are not going to do extra conflict, right? We are going to be appropriate at all times. We are just going to talk about things as needed, but we're not going to sit in that conflict as much. So knowing that if I'm talking to someone from that background and I already know their cultural awareness within that, I'm going to know that I may need to do a little bit extra prep work to bring them into this conversation, because that's naturally not something that they are used to or expected, right? So that's a way that we can use various backgrounds to be more prepared and ready to have these conversations. And then always remember that growth happens often when we're in a place of discomfort. So when we are just uncomfortable, that is often when we're going to grow the most. So I encourage you to lean into that. I talk a lot about comfort plus one. So find your comfort area and then go one beyond that. That is where I want you to stay and stick there, because you're going to feel uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean that we can't have these conversations. And remember, this is good for you, your community, and the world. It makes a difference. Okay, so before we get into some of the more details of having these conversations, I want to talk a little bit about ring theory. So what ring theory is, and I'll show you this graphic, is this came up from several psychologists who were working with trauma and working with people, and how can we best support these folks. And so this is often used in counseling, but I believe it can be used in a lot of other areas. And so this is one of them, especially in having difficult conversation. So that person in crisis, the person who has had a trauma done to them, they are going to be in the center. They as a person are then allowed to go out and complain, to explain all those kind of things, right? Because they are in the center of that crisis. And so we are going to center them in their needs. All we can do is be in those outer rings. So being the person closest to them, close family and friends, work colleagues, and so on and so forth. We are just going to put support in. We are not going to try to change how they are reacting. We are not going to try to put barriers on that. We are just giving them support. And if we are not able to give them support, then we need to take a step back, because we are here to center them and their needs as a person who has gone through a traumatic instance or has been harmed. And so as we go through the rest of this conversation, remind yourself who is in the center ring. Who is that person in crisis? And that is the person that we are really going to focus in on, instead of necessarily maybe what's coming up for us individually, because we're not the one in crisis. So intentions. Anytime we have difficult conversations, intentions are one of the first things that comes up. So we're going to talk a little bit about this. So I want you to assume good intentions, especially when you're receiving feedback. So if Christina and I are having this conversation and Christina wants to let me know that maybe something I said didn't settle right with her, I'm going to assume that when Christina and I are having this conversation, she has the best of intentions in bringing this up to me, right? People usually do this because they care about you and they want you to be better and they want to build that relationship with you. The Harvard Business Review found that most people go into these conversations with a positive frame. So we are going to assume that good intention from them. And this is going to help us to break past some of that defensiveness that can automatically come up when we're having these conversations. And that's where it stops. Okay, so your intentions stop at that moment. We can recognize that you had some good intentions, and this is on both sides, right? Whether you're the one receiving the feedback or giving the feedback. We're going to assume all those good intentions, and then we're going to pause from that, because at that point, your intentions no longer matter. It really is that impact on those individuals or individual within the situation. So we are focusing way more on the impact, because that is what is going to potentially change someone's world, not your intention. And an example that we've used in the past with this is, think about if I'm in a car and I'm backing out of my driveway, just normal day, backing out, not a problem. And next thing you know, I hear maybe a scream and I'm like, oh no, what has happened? So I get on my car and I check and I realize that I've run over someone's foot. I am saying, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to run you over, isn't going to do a lot of help, right? They're going to already assume that you did not mean to run over their foot. But the point of the fact is that their foot was run over, and we need to then address that harm that was caused so that we can fix that and move forward. So that's really then coming back and saying, how can I help you now? I'm so sorry that this happened. I want to take responsibility for that, and I want to assist you in your further healing. So focusing fully on them and knowing that they were the one that was harmed, and you potentially in a place of power, especially in the car situation. You were in the place of power with the car, and that was your responsibility to keep those other people safe, but you didn't do that. So that intention of trying doesn't matter. We're really going to focus on that impact of the person. Okay. And this especially is important to know when we come from dominant identities or backgrounds where you're going to have that power. So the people with the power are needing to give away some of that to the person they harmed so that we can actually resolve these things and come together in the future. Okay. And like we said, so after this, intention no longer matters. We're not going to be able to use intention as a reason to stop having the conversation. So just because I didn't mean to cause harm doesn't mean that we can't have this conversation and we can't work together, right? Because often what happens is we stop with, well, I didn't mean to. Well, just because you didn't mean to doesn't mean the harm wasn't done, right? And so we have to be able to move past those intentions and actually focus on our impact. So now, structured versus organic conversations. These can be fairly different. And the skills we're going to go through next are going to be really aimed at your structured conversations. So these are those call-in or call-out meetings. So if I had said something and Christina came to me and said, hey, I would like to have a conversation with you about this comment you said, right? That's going to be then a structured conversation we're going to have because we have a plan and intention of when this is happening. An organic conversation is more of something that happens in the moment that comes up. Maybe there was a microaggression and you want to point out like, ooh, I really didn't like hearing that. And I have some questions. Can we talk about that? Right? That's more of an organic conversation compared to what we're focusing on today. I strongly believe that if you practice these skills and you feel more confident about them, you will start to see yourself be more comfortable doing these organic conversations and your structured ones. So I really recommend all of these skills that we're about to go through, but just recognize that they can be different whether you're having a structured or organic conversation. Okay, so step one, identify the issue. Okay, so we're going to identify the issue that you want to talk about. And then we're going to identify, so what is the goal in talking about this issue? And so we're going to be very specific about whatever this issue is, because if we can't specifically name it for another individual, how are you expecting to actually talk about the situation, right? And like I said, we're going to talk a lot today about race and some identity aspects. So if me as a Black woman, right, I have dealt with several microaggressions in my life and discrimination. If I want to have conversations about that, I'm going to be very specific about my instance. So, for example, in a meeting I had in this last semester, someone had made a reference to how certain people were behaving to a lynch mob. That was inappropriate. And so in the moment, I was able to say, hi, yeah, saying that language really is trying to take away from the impact that lynch mobs had and still have to this day, and it's not an appropriate standard to compare something to. Can we find a new way to phrase this so it's better, right? And so that is my call to action to them of, I've identified the issue. This phrase was a problem for me, and this is why. I'd like to talk about that so we can come up with better phrasing in the future. So I'm being as clear as possible about what I want to talk about, and then I'm going to schedule a time to talk about it with that other person so that they can be prepared, they can release some of that defensiveness and anxiety that can often come up when you get those random, hi, can we talk, but I'm not going to give you any details, right? That's why we're giving all these details. We're going to be very specific about it so that we can stay on point, stay focused, and make it through these conversations. So then in your conversation, active listening is a skill we often will forget about, right? We're familiar with it, but often we will forget and kind of move on. But I want us to really focus on some of these active listening portions. So in active listening, one great way to show someone else that you are listening to them is paraphrasing back what they have said. So in that meeting example, when that person said that comment, I could paraphrase back, I heard that you had said this. Are you really referencing lynch mobs in the era of Jim Crow, or are you trying to say something else? That was a way to check their understanding in that moment, right? So I heard you said this, but this is what's happening. And so another example I have on here is, I heard you say you want to support all students, but you struggle with how. Is that correct? Instead of listening for that response, we're really just listening to them. We're trying to fully hear what they have to say. And by paraphrasing back, you're giving that other person a chance to reflect on what they say. Sometimes we're very quick-witted, right? And we say things that we don't really think through, and we really just need to take an extra second to think through that. Paraphrasing this back to someone gives them that opportunity to think through this and to acknowledge at times when they maybe have messed up. And if they don't, that's okay. You then know that they are unaware, and you can then educate them moving forward instead of making some assumptions in that case. So this is a way that we're just clearing the air. We're giving everyone a chance to process and think and move forward in the conversation. Okay. And so then how we talk in the conversation is really going to matter. So I encourage you to try to remove your emotions and focus on objective facts whenever possible. So I'm going to stay objective and say, this comment was made on this date in this setting. And then I can add in, so this is how I feel about it, right? But I'm going to first frame this of, here are the facts. Here is the exact situation that is happening. And there are exceptions to this, right? So sharing your emotions can be a powerful way to increase empathy and awareness with other folks in your community. So there are really good things about sharing your emotions. The thing I want you to guard against is when sometimes our emotions become too much for us and we're no longer productive in that conversation, right? So sometimes I get heated, right? I get angry sometimes when things happen. And I know myself well enough that if I can see that rise in myself, I can say, wait a second, Alexis, let's pause. Let's really reflect what's happening here. Why is this showing up for me so prevalently right now? Am I in the mind space where I actually could have a constructive conversation? Do I need to take a beat and just breathe? All of those things are okay, but we have to be really aware of ourselves first and foremost before we can move on to the next steps in these conversations. Okay. And with that as well, we want to move away from blaming and shaming someone else. This often doesn't help us build an understanding, and it just makes people more defensive in general. So, and the whole goal with this is we want to build an understanding. It's not necessarily that you're going to receive an apology from someone or that you're going to have a complete resolution at the end. We want to build a better understanding with that other individual, and hopefully that will come to that positive solution for us, right? And it may not always hit that way. So being aware of that and being able to release that of, that's not my responsibility to put on someone else. I'm not here to fully shame you into feeling one way or the other, right? I want to share my perspective and my understanding with you so that hopefully this increases your awareness, and maybe we will end at the same place. And if we don't, that's okay. We may have a follow-up conversation with this in that case, or we may just pause and say, we're not meant to talk about this today, and that's okay too. But the big point is that we have to start and we have to try. So using I statements. So these are the 5 steps to remember when we're going to use I statements. So step 1, when you blank. So this is the situation. When this happens, when you did this. Someone has asked before, is it helpful? Some people get really defensive automatically when you say when you can change that slightly by saying when this took place or when I heard this, right? Anything to really just say what is happening in the situation. And then I feel, or I felt, if it was in the past tense, I felt unheard. Or so here's my situational example for you all with these I statements. I was in a meeting with a colleague when I was explaining that we chose to live in Perrysburg when we moved back to this area. For us, that was just going to be a safer place for us to live and to grow as 2 Black people. And the person responded to tell me like, oh, there's no discrimination in Bowling Green. What do you mean? That doesn't exist. And so when that happened, I felt very unheard. So if I'm having this conversation with that person, I would say, when you said the discrimination never happens in Bowling Green, I felt disregarded and unheard. The story I'm telling myself is that you don't care about my lived experience. I need for you to listen to what I have to say. Would you be willing to have another conversation about this statement later on? That is a way for me to really set up how I am feeling and being more productive with my emotions. Okay, so when the situation happened, naming that very clearly, I feel, I felt, right? We feel feelings and then we think thoughts. So the story I'm telling myself, this is now what I'm thinking about my feelings and my overall thoughts within it. And then number 4, I need, want, or prefer. So what are you asking for? And then your 5 is kind of that call to action. If you can at least get through 1, 2, and 3, you will already be more set up to have these conversations. This is how we can be very careful with our emotions and being very aware with them. Okay. And I encourage you, use I statements in all sorts of conversations. I have used them in my relationship with my spouse so much more. And it's very helpful to say, oh, yes, this is the story I'm telling myself about this. And for them to then paraphrase that back to me and say, that's not exactly what I meant there, or this is what I'm really going for, right? So it's a best way to check understanding on both parts. And it uses some of those active listening and paraphrasing back skills in this 5-step process. Okay, so both and is another skill that I find really helpful within these conversations. So both and, or the yes and technique, is really what it's saying, that is in a conversation, I'm going to actively choose to bring us closer together. I'm going to actively choose to use and instead of but. So but often defines and contradicts. So it's putting us on these fully different sides, right? And sometimes we are on multiple sides of the situation. And imagine what it would look like if we could actually bring those closer together so that we feel closer together and then can work on a better understanding with one another. And so this also goes towards how there can be multiple truths in a situation. And so within that, what I want you to consider is moving away from a good, bad binary with this, right? And understanding that multiple things can be true. So for my situation with my colleague in our living, right? I could say, yes, you as a white woman have never experienced discrimination. And I, as a woman of color, have experienced discrimination. I would love to share more about my lived experience with you. That's a way for us to say, yes, both of these are true. Both of these lived experiences are true. They don't negate one or the other, right? They both can still happen. And knowing that, how can we move forward? So knowing that you may have never experienced this and I have, how can this help to change some of your understanding about a lived experience of a person of color, right? That's one way to do this. And then throwing in some additional theories in here. So Perry's stages of cognitive development, it starts with this dualism and received knowledge, meaning everything in the world is black or white. That's it. There are just two options in our entire world for things. They're either correct or they're wrong. And we're taking a lot of this information from authority figures who we believe in, right? That is where we're in the dualism. Our goal is to get into the committed and constructed knowledge where we can use all of the things to inform our decisions. So all of the things we've heard from our authority figures, our personal thoughts, other people's lived experience, we can take all of that in and then really construct how we believe. And that's what the both and technique is trying to get you closer to do. Recognize that there is more out there than just one or the other. And then we can pull all of that together to come up with a more clear, constructed knowledge to move forward. So now, what happens if the conversation isn't going well? Because this will happen, right? I can't guarantee you, even with all these skills, sometimes conversations still just will not go well. So specifically name any unhelpful behaviors, such as sarcasm, that are coming up during this conversation. So if the person you're talking to is giving you a lot of sarcastic responses or scoffing a lot, and you're really feeling that they're not hearing you, name it. If, like the entire presentation said, if we can't name these things, we can't move past them and beyond them. So we're going to name that specific behavior, such as sarcasm, during the conversation. And how that may look is that paraphrasing back. So if I have a friend who's using a lot of sarcasm, I may respond with, I'm hearing a lot of sarcasm for you. And the story I'm telling myself is that means you don't care about our conversation. Can you share more about this? And give them that opportunity then to take the reins and decide, am I going to continue with the sarcastic behavior to distract from our conversation? Or am I going to try to move forward with this other person in this conversation, right? So naming those behaviors and helping them realize what's happening for you, right? Because not everyone responds well to those different communication styles as they are happening. So we want to keep that in mind and give them an opportunity to change for the rest of our conversation. And so with that also, not everyone is ready for the conversation. So even within these structured conversations and us asking for their permission to go into the conversation and to have this, still not everyone's going to be ready, right? Some people may tell you no, that they don't want to have the conversation, and in which case you tried, right? And then we move on. And other times this can be the first time someone has ever been approached to these kind of conversations or has ever had this specific topic brought up to them. And so they could have that additional defensiveness and a lot of self-thoughts that they need to work through before you can truly have a productive conversation. So just keep that in mind, and feel free, you can give yourself a little bit of grace as you're noticing some of these conversations not going well. Know that it's okay to call a timeout. It's deciding when that becomes so hard. So when you're thinking about pausing a conversation or completely stopping a conversation, I really want you to personally reflect what's happening here. Is this because I'm starting to feel uncomfortable with what they have to say to me? Is it that I personally am not ready for this conversation? Or is it that you're getting some negative behaviors popping up from them that's making it where this conversation is no longer helpful? What's happening, right? We just need to be very specific, because often what will happen is we will get uncomfortable and we won't like where it's going. And so we'll decide, let's back away and let's just stop when the things get tough. And instead, I'm encouraging you to stick with that a little bit further and see if you can't turn around this conversation. And then if you can't, absolutely pause it. And how that may look is saying, so for multiple ways. So if this is something for me, if I notice like I'm starting to get really angry and a little hot-headed within that, I may pause and just say, I know right now my emotional state is starting to get a little more fired up. And I don't want to say something that may hurt our conversation's progress. Is it all right with you if we schedule another time to follow up with this? I just need some time to reflect and cool down. Tell them that. Be vulnerable, open, and share that with the person you're having a conversation with. Having this relationship with them is only going to help you. So let's be really aware of and cognizant of that so that we can try to move forward. And hopefully they would be open and receptive to that. And if they're not, like, then they're not. And you pause the conversation, you say, well, this is still what's best for me right now, because I've moved forward to my comfort +1. And I know that this is kind of where I need to stop. And it really encourage them that you want to have this conversation, right? I want to have this still. I just need a little more time. So be transparent and open with them and see how that goes. Okay. So now talking a little bit about classroom strategies as well. So again, prepping in advance is always going to be your #1 skill. Know the topic. So if you're in a classroom and you decide, I want to talk about Black Lives Matter, you should know all of the things within Black Lives Matter, right? You should have all of the resources prepped for you. There were a lot of great education resources specifically for the classrooms on having these and activities and all of those wonderful things. So all that should be prepped and ready. Be prepared for some of those responses, right? You may get some responses of people saying all lives matter. If that happens, you need to know how you want to respond. That's a very common response to this, right? So doing that prep is just going to prepare you for in the moment how you want to address things. And it also preps you for emotionally how you're going to do, right? So I know when people tell me, oh, all lives matter and I don't believe in Black Lives Matter, that's gonna rile me up a little bit, right? And so knowing that, I can check with myself and say, okay, where are you at in this conversation, Alexis? Are you ready to educate and to prepare and share all these all of this information with that other person? Or are you too much in your feelings right now to have a productive conversation? And then you can make some active choices within that, right? So preparing in advance is always going to be helpful. Same with setting classroom norms, and you should refer to these often. So if you haven't set classroom norms in your classroom, I highly recommend it, and specifically having them around discussion topics, especially if you know you're going to talk about some tough things, right? Having these and going back to them so the students know that you care about these discussion guidelines and you're always going to refer back. So if something pops up in your discussion, you can refer back and say, this doesn't align with our discussion guidelines. So we're going to move forward, and let's remember that these discussion guidelines are here to keep us all in a place where we can be brave together. You can also ask for a peer to observe your classroom. So if you have a specific day that you know you're going to maybe talk about a more difficult conversation, maybe it's current events, maybe it's former history that you don't know how students are going to respond to, right? Whatever that may be, you can ask a peer to come in and tell them specifically what you're looking for. Maybe you're trying to work on using the both and technique and doing some active listening. Tell your peer that so they know specifically what to watch for when they're coming to review your class. This is just going to help you work on your skills and get better in the future. And you'd be surprised what that peer can offer to you of noticing, oh, I noticed that when this happened, you responded in this way, and I don't think that's what you wanted. So giving that extra reflection time so that you can be better moving forward. And then I encourage you to invite students to share their perspectives through formal and informal evaluations, right? So this can be asking all students to share, or any student. And I want to be cognizant with this, that when we invite students to share, we shouldn't be inviting students to share for one identity and one identity only, right? So how that may look is you shouldn't ask the only Black student in your room, can you tell me all the things you feel about Black Lives Matter? That's not appropriate. They're not, no race is a monolith, meaning that everyone's going to be a little different and everyone's going to have different experiences. So if someone wants to share, let them, but don't require any one person to speak for their entire identity or group. Let me tell you, it's not a fun time, and no one really appreciates that. So open the opportunity to all students to share and just see who's feeling brave enough to share in that space. And then check in on how students are doing with readiness on 0 to 5 with that conversation. So you can frame it of saying, today we're going to talk about Confederate statues and how they have been presented in our society, right? That can be a very clear topic to talk about. And you can ask folks to say, how are you feeling about having this discussion, with 0 being I'm really intimidated, to 5 being I am ready to dive in. And let students tell you how they're feeling. That will help you gauge maybe if we need to do partner groups or one-on-one conversations. During an in the moment something that's happened in class, you can ask for folks to tell you, are you ready to address the situation? Do we want to move on? Or is this something that we feel good about right now, right? So figuring out what your class is feeling in that moment so you can follow them in their needs. Another way to do this is writing the comment on the board to remove it from a particular student. So if a student said something that you're like, ooh, that could be a hot take, it could not be. Either way, if you want to really protect that student, you can remove that comment from them, put it on the board, and have people share, okay, so we have this comment, not necessarily that the student was the one who specifically said that, right? We're just going to look at this comment in general. What are our thoughts and feelings, right? You can do word clouds to have people immediately share out. You could do some anonymous things. You can have self-reflections. Quick writes are a great opportunity to let students get some of their feelings out initially before they dive into this conversation. All of those are helpful strategies to help students start to really think through things before it's an immediate emotional, this is what I'm going to jump out and send to you, right? And then give space for emotions when needed. So especially when we're talking about these topics, for some students, it's really going to flare up some emotions for them. And if they need to take a step out to breathe and to deal with those emotions, you should absolutely let them. This is telling them that their emotions do matter, and that impact you're seeing, you recognize, and you're letting them handle it as they need to. So some of that is trust. And again, some of this is also going back to your classroom norms of what have you decided within that. When someone has gotten to that point where they're no longer going to be feeling brave in that space and they need to take a break, or do you have a space they can go in your classroom? Can they step out into the hallway and breathe for a few minutes? I've seen this happen in one of my presentations where a student was really starting to feel all of the weight of being one of the only Black students in the class. And we were talking a lot about race and privilege and how that can affect different folks. And so they took a step out, they walked outside of the class, and I completely allowed them to. It wasn't something I needed to control or to watch them for, because I respected their needs and their awareness of their own emotions. And they really appreciated that as well, because often when that happens for our students, specifically our students of color, they're often not treated as well, and they're not given that grace to say, yes, these are your big emotions and you deserve to be able to work through those. So just something to keep in mind as you're planning this. And so those are all of your big skills, right, for these structured conversations. And I want to keep in mind some microaggression aspects to this as well. So micro refers to engagements that are covert, subtle, or underhanded. So microaggressions often feel like small things, but imagine death by a million paper cuts, because that's what microaggressions are, right? It's a paper cut for every single moment of every single day, and often something you've gotten quite a bit over your time. And these can happen in a variety of ways and to a variety of populations. So do keep that in mind as well. The things to keep in mind with this. So one, I want you to acknowledge and account for the harm caused and always center that person who is harmed, right? So if this was a microaggression on race, so like one microaggression that I get a lot is, oh, you talk really clearly for a Black woman. That's not a great thing to say. Please don't say that to people. It's not a compliment. It is a microaggression, right? Because what's happening is you're telling me that most Black people aren't smart enough or literate enough to conversate with you in this manner. A, that's not true. And B, you're telling me that my intelligence as a Black culture is much lower, and that's not good either, right? So knowing that, how I would address that situation with you is one, I would account for the harm that's caused. If that happened to me or to a colleague of mine, I would ask them, so how are you feeling about this? How would you like it to be addressed? Not everyone is in a space where they can actually be brave enough to call out those microaggressions. At times, we still have to work within our systems, and it is not a safe place for us to bring that up. So checking with that person and seeing what they need is really important. And then if you can, address the cultural, systemic, and structural issues that contribute to the microaggression, right? So in that example with saying how I speak, right? I'm going to connect that to, in our society, we often believe that Black folks are less educated, which is often not true, and feel that they don't have as high of a place in our society. That is what it connects to in a larger system. And that's why I want to name those, because that's how microaggressions continue to happen. It hurts more because they're connecting to systemic issues. And then three, I'm going to address that interaction with the individual who caused it. Whoever said that comment, that's then when I'm going to have a private conversation with them to say, hi, do you recognize the harm that may have been caused by saying this comment? Can we talk more about that? I would love to share with you more about my experience, right? I'm going to bring them into that moment so that we can have a better conversation together. And then the bystander effect with this. So bystander effect refers to research that indicates that more people who witness catastrophic events are less likely to do anything. We believe that someone else is going to do it, right? We think someone else is going to sign up for that training. Someone else is going to support that student. Someone else is going to do it because there's so many people out there. So we assume someone else is going to handle it. Well, there's additional research that says that in-group favoritism will prevent you from intervening even more. So if that person who is being harmed isn't in your group, someone you identified, you're more likely not to intervene and to support that person. I'm encouraging right now, please stop doing that. Bystanders can be a great intervention. We can help disrupt microaggressions and other harms that are being caused. So please say something when you feel so brave and powerful to do so. Okay, so then all the skills we learned today, because I know we are approaching on time and I want to make sure you have time for some questions. So focus on the purpose and the goal of the conversation. Think about your intended goals and outcomes. What is your goal? I hope that is to find a better understanding, but if you have another goal, maybe it's to share your piece about a situation or to feel more connected to someone else based on a lived experience. Those are all great goals. Identify that, share that when you're having these conversations. Assume good intentions and hope in finding a better understanding. And remember that that is where they stop, right? After that, we're not going to bring up intentions for the rest of that conversation. They are checked at the door. Use the both and technique to hold space for multiple truths. Focus on your objectives, facts as much as possible. Use those I statements. Remember specifically I felt, the story I'm telling myself. If you can remember those top three, you're already in a great place. Reiteration, what someone said something about, something back to you, checking that understanding and using a part of active listening. And then handling conversations when they're no longer productive. Remember, it's okay to say you need to pause, or if you're noticing that person is maybe coming up really defensively, you can ask them if they need a break. Maybe you take 5 minutes just to breathe and you do a breathing exercise together and then you come back. right? There are lots of ways that you can pause or fully stop a conversation and either come back later, or sometimes that's just where the conversation needs to end. But the fact that you're trying is already giving you more progress. And then, of course, addressing microaggressions, as we all have the power and authority to do those things in our spaces. So I encourage you to protect those folks and do that. Okay, so now we're time for questions. I have this QR code on your screen. If you could scan that and fill out my evaluation, that's really helpful for me just to learn. As I said, I do this presentation for work as well. And so it's nice to know how you all are receptive to it and in what ways that we can adjust this to make it better. I've also sent the link in the chat, so you can click on that instead to receive the evaluation. And then I'm going to stop sharing here now. Wonderful. Okay, so we have about 4 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions about the things I've talked about today in today's presentation, or situational things that you want to kind of talk through? I'm open for them all. You can privately chat me or send them publicly or unmute. So whatever you need to do.